Welcome to Chapter 7, chapter on Duke Ellington. I'm going to open with the beginning sentences here in the chapter. Looking back over the first century of the evolution of jazz, there are a few individuals who stand above the rest as catalysts for the developing art form. Duke Ellington is one of those individuals, and that is the reason he has a chapter all to himself, because he's a giant in this industry. Okay, first thing I want to do is take a look at this chart. Will help you know what to listen for in Duke Ellington's music. Draw your attention to the playlist, which I've added in a different form this week as the list grows. Point your attention to this required listening. I think you're going to enjoy it. And there's lots and lots of additional listing of things they cite in the text. And a lot of this, as you read the text, to go listen to even little bits of this will help you understand swing music in particular and Duke Ellington's contribution to it. Okay, without further ado, let's jump into it. So, Duke Ellington was born in 1899 in Washington, D.C. He had educational advantages that some of his peers did not. For example, he received a scholarship for the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York for painting. But music was a stronger influence for him, so he didn't accept the scholarship and went ahead and pursued music. He grew up in Washington, D.C. In a family with some means, so he had the opportunity to hear some of the great ragtime pianists like Fats Waller, the Lion, who is Willie Smith, and James P. Johnson. He became a pianist himself, but he was really more adept overall. If you look at his life at the orchestra, that was his real talent, because he had just a knack for painting tonal colors with the orchestra. He also had a signature contribution by combining the Western European compositional practices with the African oral tradition of spontaneous improvisation. At age 17, he had formed his own five-piece combo called the Washingtonians, and by age 20, he had a son, Mercer, who played with his band, played trumpet in his band, and was an arranger, and also became a band leader, leading the Duke Ellington Band after Duke died. So he took over the band. So he moved to New York first in 1922, but ran into some financial difficulties, so he went back to D.C., and then Fats Waller convinced him to go back to New York in 1923. And this was a good move for him. He ended up playing his quintet, his five-piece band played at the Hollywood and Kentucky clubs on Broadway from 1923 to 1927. Gradually, he grew there into a 10-piece orchestra. He had very little turnover in band, which helped that band reach new levels. By 1926, his sound and his style had become very solid. He added a couple new people to his group that stayed and stayed and stayed. One was Harry Carney, who was a baritone sax player who stayed from 1926 to 1974. That's pretty impressive. And Johnny Hodges, his alto sax player, who stayed from 1928 to 1971, with a small break from 1951 to 55. So while he was in these New York clubs, he refined his writing and arranging skills. Another highlight is his gig at the Cotton Club. So yes, the Cotton Club is a reference to slavery. It got its name because it was only admitted white patrons. And I guess the irony is that they were listening to Duke's mostly black band. So he was at this Cotton Club, booked there from 1927 to 1932, and he had particular styles that he used there. One was called the jungle style, which was raucous and growling, and he had a mood style, which was beautiful ballads. He had a concerto style that developed there where he would feature a player and the orchestra would back them. And he had the standard style, which was a lot like what other bands were doing, but with that signature Ellington sound, a distinctive sound. Let's see. So part of his biographical highlights include, while he was at the Cotton Club, we saw him rise from an aspiring band leader to a very leading jazz figure that was internationally known. While he was there, he was also afforded opportunities um, to do special performances, to do a lot of recordings, some radio broadcasts, some film, and he began writing in larger compositions. Okay, so let's see. Um, he composed some liturgical music, that's sacred music, and he won a lot of awards. He lived until 1974. So this Cotton Club era was very important in seeing his development from an aspiring band leader to an internationally uh, known figure in jazz. Um, We've gone over that. The touring part of his life was also significant in turning him into who he was. It began in 1931, but then in 1933 he went to Europe largely to escape the Depression, and when he got there, he found out that jazz was well known in America, and so was he, and he had quite a following. And he got lots of recognition while he was there. This swing period came into being, and you'll remember the swing bands were mostly known for dancing. They had lots of gigs in ballrooms because they had that straight 4/4 driven beat that just made you want to dance. And this was not exactly Duke's style. Duke was more of an experimental band, had an intellectual side to him, not given over to just dance accompaniments. For example, his drummer played with lots of color, and as you listen to these pieces, I want you to focus in on that and hear how different that is than those driving beats that we've been listening to. He also experimented with tonal color for the sections. So instead of having all the saxes play or all the trumpets play, he might use one trumpet and two saxes with two trombones. He would just use different combinations and get different results out of that. He also featured the skills of his players. So instead of just having a trumpet solo, his trumpet solo would be tailored to who he had in the band at the time. So basically, his music was too complex for the masses. It was too complex for dances. He liked to write, and because of that, there was a slump in his activity and popularity for a time because his music was a little bit too complex for the general public. You can listen to In a Melotone and get a feel for that. Be sure to always follow the listening guides when there is one. Okay. His writing for smaller subsets, sextets, octets, nonettes, got a lot of recognition, and as soon as other bands noticed he was doing this, they followed suit and made their own little bands. In 1939, his European tour refined his approach to concert jazz, and he started writing in larger forms. Next, we want to talk about Billy Strayhorn, his collaboration with this gentleman who was raised in Hillsborough, North Carolina, so he's homegrown, one of ours. And he was also a pianist and an arranger, and he was so adept at figuring out the Ellington stamp or the Ellington style that it was difficult to tell which one of them wrote a particular piece. For example, well, they called lots of people referred to Billy Strayhorn as Duke's alter ego, and Duke used some of Strayhorn's pieces. In fact, his theme song was "Take the A Train," which was a Billy Strayhorn piece. The period that they worked together, which was about 10 years, was an incredibly creative period for the Duke Ellington band. So Strayhorn worked with him until he died, and he was working when he did die. He was working on a piece. There were other new additions to the band that made a big difference. One was the bass player Jimmy Blanton, who moved the bass player from just an instrument that played the bottom note of the chord to a melodic instrument that could be bowed, that could play melodies, that could play eighth notes and 16th notes. If you listen to some of his duets here, on some of those links, you'll get a sense of that. And Ben Webster was his tenor sax player, who played very aggressively using growls. He was nicknamed the Brute. And if you listen to Cottontail, you'll get a good example of what that was like. So let's see. You can't talk about Duke Ellington without recognizing the contributions of his lead alto player, Johnny Hodges, who was a great ballad player. So he was a good swinging thing. He was a signature voice for the Ellington band. He influenced the compositions that Duke wrote. and he had a unique tone, color, and inflection. Listen to his Passion Flower and pay close attention of how his lines grow out of those opening voices, and then he kind of continues the ensemble idea. He's just a masterful at what he does. Duke also had a really good trombone section. In fact, they were referred to as God's trombones. This included Tricky Sam Nanton, Juan Tizo, and Lawrence Brown. He had a trumpet player named Rick Stewart who made his trumpet sound like vocals by pressing the valves halfway down and playing that way. So Duke had a lot of sidemen who he was famous for. Duke himself was a dapper, elegant man. He was handsome, he was sophisticated, he was suave, he wore tailored suits, expensive shirts and ties, very particular in how he dressed, how he presented himself. His music is equally particular, and he was always writing music, whether he was in a restaurant or on a train. He always had music going on in his head and writing down ideas. Okay, moving on to, well, let's see. The band kind of had a transition period at the turn of World War II, 1943 to 1951. There was a lot of turnover in the band. There was a demise of big bands, and there was a decline of gigs in ballrooms and nightclubs. There was this challenge being mounted by bebop, a new style. But Ellington was an experimenter in jazz, and bebop was the new experiment, but he didn't follow that style. He became a major statement of jazz, following his own path. Working in larger forms, trying different things, film, religious music, sacred music, working constantly for that balance between art and commercialization, because you do need an audience after all, but you don't have to sell out to the audience. So he stayed true to himself throughout his life. Late Ellington, we saw a lot of success at the Newport Jazz Festival from the years 1956 to 65. We also saw him writing for people like Dizzy Gillespie and John Coltrane, people we're going to be introduced to in the next chapters of Bop. He won a lot of awards. If you listen to A Drum is a Woman, he narrates as he paints the history of jazz. He also collaborated with Billy Strayhorn on Shakespearean Suite, and also a soundtrack for a film called Anatomy of Murder. He wrote 2 concerts for sacred music. The Baptists thought that this sacred music deserved to be in a concert hall rather than a church, and in fact he did get to play one of these at Carnegie Hall. When he died in 1974, there were 12,000 people that attended his funeral, which is pretty impressive. He left a great legacy. What some of the things that he did was he balanced things. He balanced dichotomies. For example, the individual player versus the group expression, improvisation versus composition, the marketplace demands of musicians versus pursuing his own personal ideology in his music. He had struck good balances in these, and his individual players, they drove his jazz. They influenced how he wrote, and he gave them lots and lots of credit. In fact, he'd give his sidemen credit, and they'd give it right back to him. So there was a mutual affection and awareness of this good thing they had going. He was criticized for his openness in larger form writings, but he wanted to leave room for these sidemen that had all these great ideas. He excelled at creating hybrid jazz, blending that European and African traditions. There was a lot of innovations, ensemble sounds, large forms, skillful orchestrations, using voices as instruments, innovation of the tunes themselves, new use of instruments, and you'd do yourself a favor by listening to these. He also did a lot of collaborations. This is a good thing to listen to and watch. And his repertoire. So he had some early recordings in 1923, the earliest ones, and then others from 1927 to 31. His greatest ones came in the 40s. Altogether, he had more than 150 albums that the Smithsonian Institute has preserved. His repertoire had good variety and diversity. He played everywhere: dance halls, clubs, theaters, festivals, concert halls. He even did some stuff with civil rights themes like Jump for Joy and Black, Brown, and Beige. He didn't hesitate to hire white players if they were the best. His drummer was white, Louis Bellson, And this quote we're going to end with: "We see him today as the most challenging, most provocative, most brilliant, and most irreplaceable paragon in the 60-year history of jazz." Quote by Leonard Feather. Hope you enjoy it.